Some games are legendary. Such is the case for The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game, featuring the epic quest of Link recovering the Master Sword, rescuing Zelda, and defeating both the evil wizard Aghanim and Ganon, was many players' first experience with the Zelda franchise. For many, including myself, it was the best entry in the series. In today's video, I want to touch on the development of A Link to the Past, including revealing some lesser-known information about the game and discussing what made it so great. A Link to the Past was the third installment in the Zelda franchise. It was preceded by two Zelda games. First was the original, The Legend of Zelda. This game set the standard for action-adventure games by creating a vast open world, 9 complex dungeons, and an entire second game within the first. It sold more than 6.5 million copies and started the entire franchise. The Adventure of Link, the sequel, changed the formula into an action RPG and side-scrolling platformer. It wasn't quite as successful, and certainly not as beloved, but it sold more than 4.38 million copies and became the 8th best-selling game on the Nintendo. You can find more on the Adventures of Link in our video, link in the description. The success of these games meant that Nintendo was more or less required to keep going, and that they did. Game development on A Link to the Past began in either 88 or 89, sources kind of conflicted on the actual date. What does seem clear is that the development roughly began alongside the creation of Super Mario World, and years before the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo were released. That meant that the original planning on A Link to the Past started for the regular Nintendo, which, when you get right down to it, is insane. As we'll discuss, a game like A Link to the Past simply could not have fit into the regular Nintendo's technical specifications. The game saw the old band getting back together. It was produced by the legend Shigeru Miyamoto and directed by Takashi Tezuka, who had directed the first Zelda game and wrote the second. The developers of the game were the Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, or Nintendo EAD, also known as Nintendo R&D 4. This department developed some of Nintendo's most successful games, including Super Mario Bros. And the original Legend of Zelda. Nintendo EAD had more than a few things working in its favor. Chief among them was more budget and more staff. The success of the previous two Zelda games and other games developed by EAD meant that developers would not want for resources. Instead, quite the opposite. Nintendo made sure that the department had everything they needed to be successful. In a 1991 interview, Miyamoto implied that the number of people working on the development of the game would ebb and flow, saying that more members of the team were added in November 1990 as the game began to approach completion. That additional investment also came in the form of additional storage space. At the time, most Super Nintendo games had 512 kilobytes of storage space. A Link to the Past was one of the first games to invest in a 1 megabit cartridge. Developers were then able to use graphical compression techniques and reduce colors to maximize available space. That available space meant that the game had a massive amount of space for levels, dungeons, graphics, and more. The larger cartridge size gave developers more room to expand, experiment, and play. Miyamoto's style of development management fed into the idea of careful creativity, expanding teams as needed. In developing the game, Miyamoto said that developers would, quote, begin by doing a bunch of silly experiments with a small number of people. Then, once the project begins to take shape, we put a larger amount of staff to work on it. This strategy allowed Miyamoto to test the limits of the hardware. Further helping that test? The move to Super Nintendo itself. As Miyamoto noted, quote, with the way things are now, you can't really express yourself, right? The Super Nintendo makes it easy. These days, it is far more straightforward to realize all the things you've wanted to do, but haven't been able to. Game development has gotten much easier in more ways than one. Graphics and sounds immediately went from pixels and bloops to 256 color graphics with high quality music created by the legendary Koji Kondo. The Super Nintendo also allowed for the use of multiple graphical layers. Now, you could have sprites, graphics, special effects, a HUD system, all on the screen at the same time. The key innovation of A Link to the Past was the use of light and dark worlds. According to director Takashi Tezuka, in the original concept, there would be multiple worlds connected by a hub world, and what happened in the hub world would impact other worlds. That concept was eventually scrapped for what we saw, 2 overlapping worlds that could impact each other. Developers decided to go with a light and dark world, one which fit ideally into story elements, and allowed for what happened in one world to be felt in the other. That move to Super Nintendo allowed for a new expansive story, and one that was replete with more dramatic beats than ever before. In this game, the evil wizard Aghanim has taken control of Hyrule and imprisoned Zelda. Zelda, using telepathy, sends a message to Link and his uncle. Link's uncle is injured, and he turns the quest over to Link, who must rescue the princess, capture the Master Sword, and defeat Aghanim. Link does so, but only after Zelda is recaptured and Link is sent to the Dark World, an evil reflection of Hyrule. There, he must free 7 maidens and ultimately, once again, defeat Aghanim and then Ganon. The plot of the game, like Zelda 2, also hinted at a broader timeline that didn't quite move in a linear order. The game is largely disconnected from the plot of the events of its 2 predecessors. In the official timeline, this game takes place as the first in the Defeated Hero timeline, in which Link is defeated at the conclusion of the Ocarina of Time. However, we didn't know that at the time, and many players were left scratching their heads trying to figure out how the events of all three games fit together, or if there was even any attempt to do so at all. As a 9-year-old playing this game, I vaguely remember first exploring the concept of video game plot magic. Enhancing the story was the way that the game told its greatest scenes. The game is chock full of pivotal dramatic moments that, in many cases, managed to sear their way into the brains of players. Waking up and watching your uncle leave only to find him later bleeding on the floor. Rescuing Princess Zelda, capturing the Master Sword, defeating Aghanim for the first time. These moments are dramatically enhanced by the layered graphics and remarkable soundtrack. From the cinematic to the mundane, the move to the Super Nintendo also resulted in additional features being added to the game, like draining water to access new entrances or burning bushes. These features were actually meant to be in Zelda 1, but the system wasn't capable of handling it. Concepts we regard as basic, like walking diagonally or seeing Link swing a sword as opposed to just, kind of poking it forward, were also added. The additional resources didn't mean that Nintendo could do everything it originally wanted. In an interview conducted after the development of A Link to the Past had already started, Miyamoto said that Zelda 3 would feature a party system, including, quote, a girl who looked a little like a fairy, whose role consisted of reconnaissance. Like the characters in action games that don't engage enemies in combat, but rather go and scout out the surroundings and return to you safely. Specifically, Miyamoto said that the fairy who appeared in Zelda 2 was going to be that party member. Miyamoto also wanted a diagonal thrust added to swordplay, but that wound up resulting in declined operability of the game. The famed spin attack was put in its place. This wasn't the only feature that wound up on the cutting room floor. Miyamoto had also wanted to allow the player to start grass fires with the lantern, cause water to rush into holes created by the shovel, and more. Eventually, time and space won, and some ideas had to go. Fortunately, technology continued to evolve, and these features were put into later games, like the ability to start grass fires in Four Swords Adventures. Speaking of features you'd eventually see, this is fascinating. Tezuka also told interviewers that he wanted to create a system that allowed for weapons to be combined and used in a free-flowing manner, like a sword bomb. Of course, that wasn't used in this game, with Tezuka citing Miyamoto's desire to always have Link have a sword. The feature of combining items would absolutely be seen in later games. Prior to A Link to the Past, only The Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link had been released. As we covered in our earlier video, again, link in the description, the two games were very different. Zelda is more of an action-adventure game, while Link takes a distinctly different tact, serving more like a traditional RPG game with platforming elements. However, Miyamoto's preference for which game was better was clear, with him once saying, quote, Zelda 2 was sort of a failure. In another interview, he said, quote, we actually see A Link to the Past as the real sequel to The Legend of Zelda. Zelda 2 was more of a side story about what happened to Link after the events of Legend of Zelda. Now, this may not jive with the timeline of Zelda, but in a 2003 interview, Miyamoto said that he was fine with that, noting, quote, to be honest, story is not that important to us. We care more about developing the game system. Give the player new challenges for every chapter that is born. The most important thing for me is that the player gets sucked into the game. As such, A Link to the Past was explicitly designed to be more like the original game. This meant a top-down playstyle, a grid-style map, and the lack of traditional RPG elements like stats. The game did feature the introduction of additional weapons and items in a way that most Zelda players now know as standard. For example, A Link to the Past is the first game that features the Master Sword. Getting the sword is a major achievement in and of itself, as well as a requirement to progress within the game. Other Zelda staples included flippers, the hookshot, and the dash attack, which was necessary to break through walls and access certain items. These features would make later appearances in future games. Puzzles were prevalent throughout the game as well. Some easy, some not so much. Nintendo balanced the difficulty levels very carefully. At one point, they actually tried putting in more hints, but playtesting showed that players found those hints to make the game too boring. As such, Nintendo went with their original reflexes and left in the more challenging and hintless puzzles. Dungeons, always a staple of the Zelda franchise, took on a whole new level of meaning and additional difficulty. New facets were added, including multi-level dungeons that often required players to use transporters or fall through holes to access certain items. Link to the Past dungeons also required the use of the Big Key, which was required to get to bosses and access each dungeon's special treasure. Also, it wouldn't be a Link to the Past video if I didn't discuss the infamous Chris Houlihan room. It's a wild story and kind of a sad one. The story of the Chris Houlihan room started in 1990 when the Nintendo Power magazine held a contest. Take a photo of the War Mech, a powerful enemy from Final Fantasy. Yes, an actual photo. Submit that photo to Nintendo, and the winner would randomly appear in a new and undisclosed game. That winner was Chris Houlihan, thus creating the Chris Houlihan room. This room has a telepathy tile reading, "My name is Chris Houlihan. This is my top secret room. Keep it between us, okay?" The room itself contains 45 rubies, worth a total of 225 coins. Now, the kick. Accessing the room. There are numerous ways of doing so, all of which largely revolve around the use of the Pegasus boots and dashing from the right spot. It makes sense that the room would actually be hard to get into. It was designed to be an error room. If the game didn't know where you were going, you would default there. Sadly, that ruins much of the joy of the room. The only way you can get there is by accident. Imagine being a kid and you're all excited, you're going to be a Super Nintendo game, you tell all of your friends, brag everywhere, and then you can't find the room. As best as I could tell, the public at large only became aware of the room in the 2000s, when emulators enabled players to easily find things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. One more final coda to this strange tale. Unless I'm wrong, no one has found an interview with the real Chris Houlihan. I found one internet forum post from a guy who claims to be him, but it's the internet, so who knows? This does beg an important question. Did Chris Houlihan ever really exist? Anyway, back to the game. It was set to be released in March 1991, a few months after the release of the Super Famicom, but that proved impossible. Final feature implementation took 8 months, longer than estimates, and that meant that the game was ultimately released in Japan on November 21st, 1991. Ironically, a year to the day after the release of the Super Famicom. North America and Europe would get the game in April and September of 1992. Of course, it was a hit. Critics glowed over the game, crowing over its graphics, plot, score, and innovations. Famitsu magazine gave it a 39 out of 40, one of the highest scores it had ever given. Nintendo Power called it the second best game of the year. In the end, the original version sold more than 4.6 million copies worldwide, ranking 7th on the best-selling all-time list. The positive critical and sales reception made the game an all-time classic. IGN called it the best game in Super Nintendo history, saying, quote, "A Link to the Past made that series a legend." Nintendo Life gave it its number 2 ranking, second only to Super Mario World. Entertainment Weekly, Next Generation, and Popular Mechanics all called it the best game of all time, while G4, Game Reactor, and IGN said it was the second best game ever made on any system. A game this good can't get released only once. It was re-released on the Game Boy Advance in 2002 as A Link to the Past and Four Swords, where it sold an additional 6.5 million copies. It would then become available on numerous later Nintendo consoles, including the Wii, Wii U, Switch, and SNES Classic. A sequel, A Link Between Worlds, would be made available on the 3DS in 2013. You again play as Link, where you must rescue Zelda and stop the evil sorcerer Yuga. The unique feature of this game was the ability to merge into walls as a 2D painting, a highly different concept for most Zelda games. The game sold well, moving more than 4.26 copies by 2022, while also receiving critical acclaim. A Link to the Past was so perfect for so many of us because it captured everything that made the Zelda series great. The technological advances of the Super Nintendo made much of the original intent of the developers possible, allowing players to explore 2 incredible worlds, defeat puzzles, engage in brand new mechanics, and so much more. The massive leap between the previous games was clear, and A Link to the Past made it obvious. Zelda was a top Nintendo franchise, and one that would enchant players for generations. These memories made the game great, and now I ask you, what memories do you have of A Link to the Past? What made the game so great for you? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm thinks you may enjoy. Have a wonderful day out there, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, folks.